The air in the courtroom buzzed with tension. Jake Evans, a 38-year-old man with calloused hands, sat at the table, clutching the edge of his chair. Across from him was his wife, Laura, cool and confident in an expensive suit, next to a lawyer whose smile screamed, "You've already lost." The fate of their marriage, their business, his life was being decided today. But Jake had a trick up his sleeve, a file that could change everything. The rain tapped a steady rhythm against the windows of the modest two-story house in Bellevue, a leafy suburb just east of Seattle. Inside, Jake Evans, a 38-year-old man with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, sat at the kitchen table, nursing a mug of black coffee. The clock on the wall ticked towards 6:30 a.m., and the house was still, save for the soft snoring of Buddy, their chocolate Labrador, sprawled across the living room rug. This was Jake's favorite time of day, the calm before the world woke up, before the emails piled in or the phone started buzzing. Jake was the kind of guy you could count on. He wasn't loud or flashy, didn't need to be the center of attention. For 15 years, he'd been the steady hand behind the scenes, fixing leaky faucets, mowing the lawn, and cheering on the Seattle Seahawks every Sunday with a beer in hand. By day, he worked as a project manager for a small construction firm, coordinating builds across King County. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave him a sense of purpose, building things that lasted. His real pride, though, was the life he'd built with Laura, his wife. They'd met in their early 20s, back when she was a scrappy design student with big dreams, and he was a carpenter's apprentice with a knack for numbers. Laura's passion for interior design had sparked something in Jake, and together they dreamed up Evergreen Designs, her company that turned empty spaces into magazine-worthy homes. In the early days, it was just the two of them in a cramped apartment, Laura sketching ideas on napkins while Jake built her first website and balanced their shoestring budget. He'd never minded playing the supporting role. Laura was the visionary, the one who charmed clients and closed deals at glitzy networking events. Jake was content to handle the grunt work, filing taxes, chasing invoices, making sure the lights stayed on. He'd stay up late crunching numbers so she could focus on her designs, drive across town to check on suppliers, even pour drinks at her first big client mixer while she worked the room. "We're a team," she'd say, her eyes bright with ambition. "You and me, Jake. We're gonna make it." And he believed her. But somewhere along the way, the team started to fray. Evergreen Designs took off, landing contracts with tech moguls and boutique hotels. Laura's name was in design blogs, her face on local TV. She traded jeans for tailored suits, late-night brainstorming for exclusive galas. Jake didn't begrudge her success. He was proud, even if he stayed in the shadows. But the distance grew. She'd come home late, her phone glued to her hand, barely glancing at him. Their conversations dwindled to logistics. "Did you pay the utility bill?" Or, "I'm out of town next week." But he got more attention than Jake did. Still, he held on. This was their life, their dream. The house in Bellevue, with its cedar siding and the backyard garden he'd planted for her, was proof of what they'd built. He'd spent weekends repainting the walls in the soft sage green she loved, fixing the creaky porch steps, making it theirs. Even when Laura started snapping at him for small things, forgetting to reorder printer ink or not RSVPing to some fancy event, he brushed it off. She was stressed, he told himself. The business was big now. It'd pass. That morning, as the rain streaked the windows, Jake sipped his coffee and scrolled through his phone, checking the Seahawks schedule. Buddy stirred, patting over to nudge Jake's knee for a scratch. "All right, bud." Jake chuckled, ruffling the dog's ears. Upstairs, he heard Laura moving around, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Early riser, as always. She'd probably be out the door before he finished his second cup, off to some meeting or photo shoot. He didn't know it yet, but today wasn't going to be like the others. The quiet routine he'd leaned into for years, the coffee, the dog, the house, the marriage, was about to crack wide open. In a few minutes, Laura would walk into the kitchen, and everything Jake thought he knew about his life would change. For now, he sat there, unaware, the steam curling off his mug, the rain drumming softly outside. He was just Jake Evans, a guy who fixed things, who loved his wife, who believed in the life they'd built. A guy who didn't yet know he was standing on the edge of a fight he'd never seen coming. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time Jake Evans heard Laura's heels clicking down the stairs. He glanced up from his phone, expecting her usual rushed goodbye, a quick wave as she grabbed her keys and headed out. Instead, she paused in the kitchen doorway, her silhouette sharp against the dim morning light. Laura, 37, looked every bit the polished professional she'd become. Charcoal blazer, sleek ponytail, a designer bag slung over her shoulder. But there was something off. Her lips were pressed tight, her eyes fixed on the countertop, not on him. "Morning," Jake said, his voice warm but cautious. He set his coffee mug down, Buddy's tail thumping softly against the floor. Laura didn't answer right away. She crossed to the counter, her movements deliberate, and slid a manila envelope toward him. The sound of it scraping across the granite was louder than it should have been in the quiet house. "This is from my lawyer," she said, her tone flat, like she was reading a grocery list. "It's for the divorce. Should be straightforward." Jake froze, his hand still hovering over his mug. The word divorce hit like a sucker punch, stealing the air from his lungs. He stared at the envelope, its edges crisp and unyielding, as if it held something radioactive. "What?" he managed, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Laura finally looked at him, her hazel eyes cold and distant. "It's over, Jake. I've been clear about this for a while. You had to see it coming." Had he? Jake's mind raced, scrambling to piece together the last few years. The late nights she spent at the office, the weekends she was too busy for dinner, the way she'd brush off his attempts to talk. He chalked it up to stress, to the grind of running Evergreen Designs. He told himself they'd find their way back, like they always had. But this was a bomb, and she just pulled the pin. He reached for the envelope, his fingers clumsy as he fumbled with the clasp. Inside was a stack of legal papers, the words blurring together under the kitchen's fluorescent light. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Laura's signature was already there, neat and sharp, like she'd signed a contract for a new client. He flipped through, his heart hammering, and stopped cold at the asset division. She wanted everything: the house in Bellevue, the business, their savings. Jake would walk away with nothing, not even the pickup truck he'd paid off last year. "Zero." "Laura," he said, his voice cracking as he looked up. "What is this? After everything?" She sighed, setting her phone down with a small clink. "You didn't keep up, Jake. I built Evergreen. I grew. You didn't." Her words were a blade, slicing through 15 years of shared dreams, late-night talks, and promises. "You were fine being the guy in the background, but I need more. I deserve more." Jake's chest tightened, a hot mix of hurt and anger bubbling up. He wanted to shout, to demand how she could erase him like this. He'd been there from the start, building her website, tracking expenses, shaking hands with her first investors. He'd stayed up until 2 a.m. fixing her spreadsheets when she was too tired, driven across Seattle to pick up fabric samples when she forgot. He wasn't the face of Evergreen Designs, sure, but he was its backbone. And now she was tossing him out like he'd been hired help. "You can't just," he started, but she cut him off. "It's done," she said, grabbing her bag. "Read the papers. Sign them. Let's not make this messy." She turned toward the door, her heels clicking again, each step a nail in the coffin of their marriage. The front door shut with a soft thud, and the house swallowed Jake in silence. He sat there, the papers trembling in his hands, staring at the life he thought he knew. The garden he'd planted for her bloomed outside the window, the sage-green walls he'd painted surrounded him, the couch they'd picked out together sat across the room. 15 years, and she'd reduced it to this, a stack of demands that left him with nothing. Jake's eyes burned, but he didn't cry. Not yet. He dropped the papers onto the table and leaned back, his jaw tight, his breathing shallow. Buddy nudged his leg, whining softly, but Jake barely noticed. His mind was replaying her words. "You didn't keep up. I grew. You didn't." They stung because part of him wondered if she was right. Had he been too comfortable, too content to let her shine? Had he missed the signs, ignored the cracks in their foundation? He stood, pacing the kitchen, the tiles cold under his socks. The envelope stared back at him, a challenge he hadn't asked for. He could sign it, walk away, start over somewhere else. But the thought made his stomach churn. This wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about who he was, what he'd given, what she thought she could take. By the time the rain stopped, Jake was still standing, his coffee long gone cold. He didn't have a plan, not yet, but something was shifting inside him. Not just hurt, not just anger, but a spark of something harder, resolve. Laura thought she'd ended it with that envelope. She didn't know she'd just lit a fuse. The fluorescent lights in the King County courthouse buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the packed courtroom. Jake Evans sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking. The divorce hearing, his first since Laura dropped the bomb a month ago, was supposed to be straightforward, a formality before the asset split. But the air felt heavy, charged with something Jake couldn't name. Across the room, Laura sat poised in a navy suit, her face a mask of calm. Beside her, Neil Crow, her shark of a lawyer, leaned back with a smirk that made Jake's stomach twist. Jake, now 38 and feeling every year of it, had spent the last 4 weeks in a haze. He'd moved into a cramped apartment in Renton, a far cry from their Bellevue home. The place smelled of stale carpet, and Buddy's confused pacing at night was the only sound breaking the silence. Jake had pored over the divorce papers, each line a fresh cut. Laura wanted the house, evergreen designs, their savings, everything. He'd hired a lawyer, Aiden Harris, an old college buddy who worked at a small firm in Tacoma. Aiden was sharp but outmatched by Neil's big-shot reputation. "We'll fight for your share," Aiden had promised, but Jake wasn't so sure. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret Voss, shuffled papers at the bench. "Let's proceed with the asset division," she said, her voice clipped. Neil stood, smoothing his tie, and launched into a polished speech about Laura's singular vision for evergreen designs. "My client built this company from nothing," he said, his tone dripping with confidence. Mr. Evans contributed minimally, if at all. His role was clerical at best. Jake's jaw tightened. Clerical? He'd been the one balancing budgets, chasing late payments, building the damn website when Laura didn't know a pixel from a paint chip. He glanced at Aiden, who scribbled notes, his face tense. But before Aiden could respond, Neil dropped a grenade. "Your Honor," Neil said, sliding a folder across the table, "we've uncovered evidence of financial irregularities tied to Mr. Evans during his time at Evergreen Designs. Bank records show unauthorized transfers to an account in his name, totaling over $50,000. The courtroom murmured. Jake's heart stopped. He turned to Aiden, his voice low and urgent. "What the hell is he talking about?" Aiden shook his head, his eyes wide. "I don't know. They didn't disclose this." Judge Voss raised an eyebrow, taking the folder from the bailiff. She flipped through it, her expression darkening. "Mr. Evans, these are serious allegations. Can you explain these transactions?" Jake's mouth went dry. I don't know anything about this," he stammered, his voice sounding small in the vast room. "I never touched the company's money." But the words felt hollow, even to him. The room seemed to tilt, Laura's cool gaze boring into him from across the aisle. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just watched, like she'd already won. Neil pressed on, his voice smooth as oil. "Your Honor, these records suggest Mr. Evans siphoned funds for personal use, undermining my client's business. We request a forensic audit and move to freeze his assets pending investigation." The murmurs grew louder. Jake felt every eye in the room on him, strangers, court staff, even Aiden, whose pen had stopped moving. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. Laura wasn't just taking everything. She was painting him as a thief, a criminal. The betrayal cut deeper than the divorce papers, sharper than her cold words in the kitchen. She'd planned this, twisted their shared history to bury him. Aiden shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence wasn't shared in discovery. We need time to review." "Granted," Judge Voss cut in, her tone sharp. "We'll recess for 1 week. Mr. Evans, I suggest you prepare a response." She banged her gavel, and the room erupted into whispers. Jake sat frozen, the folder on the judge's bench like a loaded gun. Laura and Neil swept out, her heels clicking, his smirk intact. Back in his apartment that night, Jake paced, the TV flickering with a muted Seahawks game he couldn't focus on. Buddy whined at his feet, sensing the tension. The accusation was a lie. Jake had never taken a dime from Evergreen. But the bank records were real, or at least real enough to fool a judge. How had Laura done this? And why? He sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. Then he noticed it. A plain envelope slipped under his door. No stamp, no address. His pulse spiked as he tore it open. Inside was a single page, a bank statement from an account he'd never seen, listing transfers to a Trevor Kane. The amounts matched Neil's claims, but the account wasn't Jake's. A handwritten note was scrawled at the bottom. "Look closer." Jake stared at it, his mind racing. Trevor Kane. The name meant nothing, but the note was a lifeline, a crack in Laura's perfect plan. Someone knew something. Someone wanted him to fight back. He grabbed his phone and called Aiden. "We've got a lead," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I don't know who sent it, but it's a start." Aiden was cautious. "This is weird, Jake. Be careful. If Laura's framing you, she's not playing small." Jake hung up, the statement still in his hand. The betrayal burned, but it was waking something in him, a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Laura thought she could erase him, rewrite him as the villain. She was wrong. He didn't know how yet, but he'd find the truth. And when he did, she'd regret underestimating him. Jake Evans sat in his dimly lit Renton apartment, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across the cluttered coffee table. Papers were strewn everywhere. Bank statements, old Evergreen Designs contracts, and that mysterious note. Look closer. The Seahawks game flickered silently on the TV, but Jake's focus was razor-sharp. It had been 3 days since the courthouse bombshell, where Laura and her lawyer, Neil Crow, accused him of stealing $50,000 from her company. The lie had nearly broken him, but that anonymous bank statement, pointing to a Trevor Kane, had lit a fire. Jake wasn't just fighting for his share of the divorce anymore. He was fighting for his name, his truth. At 38, Jake had spent years being the quiet one, the guy who fixed problems without fanfare. But Laura's betrayal, framing him as a thief, had cracked something open. He wasn't the naive husband who'd trusted her blindly. Not anymore. The sting of her words in their kitchen, "You didn't keep up," still lingered, but now they fueled him. She thought he'd roll over, sign the papers, disappear. She'd miscalculated. Jake's first move was calling Aiden Harris, his lawyer and old college friend. Aiden had been blunt. "If they're framing you, we need hard proof to flip this. Dig into everything. Accounts, emails, anything you can access legally." Jake had nodded, though legally felt like a tightrope. He'd also reached out to Mia Chun, a cybersecurity freelancer recommended by a mutual friend. Mia, a sharp 30-year-old with a knack for finding digital needles in haystacks, had agreed to help. "If there's dirt, I'll get it," she'd said over coffee in Tacoma. "But you stay clean. No hacking, no shortcuts." Jake started with what he had: access to old Evergreen Designs cloud files. Laura had never bothered changing the passwords from the early days. Back when Jake handled the company's admin late into the night, he sifted through invoices and expense reports, his eyes burning from the screen's glare. At first, it was just noise, client names, project codes, dollar amounts. Then he spotted it: a $10,000 payment to T. Kane Consulting for design advisory services. No contract, no deliverables, just a vague label. He cross-checked the dates. More payments, scattered over 2 years, totaling $75,000. Trevor Kane wasn't a consultant. He was a ghost. Mia came through the next day, meeting Jake at a diner off I-5. She slid a USB drive across the table, her voice low. "I pulled metadata from the company's email server. Public domain stuff, nothing illegal. Found a thread between Laura and someone named TK. It's cryptic, but they're talking about rerouting funds and keeping it off the books. I couldn't trace TK's full identity yet, but it's not you." Jake's pulse quickened. This was the thread he needed to pull. Back home, he dove deeper, matching the email dates to the payments. The pattern was clear. Money flowed to Kane right before big client contracts closed, like a hidden commission. But why frame Jake? He found a clue in an old spreadsheet Laura had locked him out of years ago, now accessible through a forgotten backup. It listed administrative adjustments signed off by Jake, except he'd never signed them. His name was there, forged, tied to transfers he'd never seen. Laura hadn't just stolen from the company. She'd built a paper trail to pin it on him. The realization hit like a freight train. This wasn't just about greed. Laura was covering something bigger, and Jake was her scapegoat. His hands shook as he printed the files, stacking them in a folder that grew thicker by the hour. But the deeper he dug, the more he felt eyes on him. Yesterday, his mailbox had a typed note: "Stop digging." No signature, just block letters. His truck's tires had been slashed overnight, costing him $200 to replace. Coincidences? He didn't think so. Jake called Aiden, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "I've got proof, forged signatures, fake payments. It's enough to clear me and turn this on her." Aiden was cautious. "Send it over, but watch your back. If she's desperate, she'll push harder." Mia echoed the warning, texting, "Be paranoid. Change your passwords." Jake did, locking down his accounts and keeping his laptop offline when he wasn't using it. The turning point came late one night, rain pattering against the apartment windows. Jake sat with Buddy curled at his feet, staring at the folder. He'd spent years being Laura's shadow, trusting her vision, believing in their team. That Jake would have signed the papers, walked away broken. But the man he was now? He was done playing small. This folder wasn't just evidence, it was his fight, his proof he wasn't the nobody she thought. He leaned back, the weight of it settling in. Laura had underestimated him, but so had he. He'd built half her empire, and he knew its secrets better than she thought. With Aiden's legal muscle and Mia's digital sleuthing, he was ready to hit back, hard, but clean. The threats, the lies, the forged signatures, they'd all come crashing down in that courtroom. Laura thought she'd buried him. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The King County Courthouse was a pressure cooker on the final day of the divorce hearing. Jake Evans sat at the defendant's table, his hands steady on the wornwood, a thick folder of evidence resting in front of him. At 38, he looked different now, his jaw set, his eyes sharp with purpose. The past month had reshaped him, forging the quiet husband who'd once lived in Laura's shadow into a man who'd uncovered her lies. Across the room, Laura sat rigid, her tailored suit unable to mask the tension in her posture. Her lawyer, Neil Crow, fidgeted with his pen, his usual smirk replaced by a tight-lipped unease. Jake's folder, packed with proof of fraud, forged signatures, and payments to the mysterious Trevor Kane, had already rattled them. Today, he'd finish it. The courtroom hummed with anticipation. Judge Margaret Voss, her glasses perched low, called the session to order. "Final submissions," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Neil stood, launching into a rehearsed plea for Laura to keep Evergreen Designs and the Bellevue house. His words were smooth, but Jake caught the strain, the way Neil's eyes flicked to the folder. Aiden Harris, Jake's lawyer, leaned close, whispering, "They're scared. Let's do this." Jake nodded, his heart pounding but his resolve ironclad. He'd spent weeks building this case with Aiden and Mia Chin, the cybersecurity freelancer who dug up digital gold. The folder held it all: emails linking Laura to Trevor Kane, a financial fixer, forged signatures tying Jake to fake transfers, and invoices for non-existent services, siphoning $200,000 from the company. Laura hadn't just betrayed him, she'd built a house of cards, and Jake was about to knock it down. "Your Honor," Jake said, standing as Aiden nudged him. His voice was calm, deliberate. "I have evidence that clears my name and exposes misconduct by Mrs. Evans." He slid the folder to the bailiff, who carried it to the bench. Laura's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. Neil shot to his feet, sputtering, "Objection. This is irrelevant to the divorce." Judge Voss silenced him with a look. "I'll decide what's relevant." She opened the folder, her fingers moving slowly at first, then pausing as she read. The room went still, the only sound the rustle of pages. Jake watched Laura's face, her calm facade crumbling, her hands trembling in her lap. He didn't gloat, didn't need to. The truth was doing the talking. Voss's expression darkened with each page. She stopped, peering over her glasses at Laura. "Mrs. Evans, these documents show payments to shell accounts, forged signatures, and what appears to be systematic fraud. Can you explain?" Laura stammered, her voice thin. Those are misrepresentations." "I don't," Neil tried to interject, but Voss cut him off. "I'm not asking you, counsel." The questions came hard and fast. What services did Trevor Kane provide for $75,000? Why are these transfers dated to coincide with client payments? Laura's answers were weak, unraveling under Voss's scrutiny. Neil's face reddened, his arguments falling flat. Jake sat back, letting the moment sink in. For years, he'd been invisible, the guy who fixed Laura's messes. Now, he was the one exposing them. Voss closed the folder, her voice grave. "These allegations go beyond this court. I'm referring this evidence to the district attorney for investigation. The divorce is settled. Mr. Evans retains the Bellevue property and half the remaining assets." Court adjourned. The gavel banged, and the room erupted. Laura stared at the table, drained of color, while Neil gathered papers with jerky movements. Jake walked out, Aiden clapping his shoulder. "You did it, man. They're done." But Jake's mind was already elsewhere. The victory felt heavy, not triumphant. He'd cleared his name, but at what cost? 2 weeks later, the news broke. Laura was arrested for fraud and money laundering. Evergreen Designs collapsed, clients suing as the Fed seized records. Neil faced disbarment for his role in covering it up. Trevor Kane vanished, likely overseas. Jake got the house and a chunk of their savings, but he didn't stay in Bellevue. The memories were too loud. He sold the house and moved to Redmond, a quiet town by Lake Sammamish. With the settlement, he bought a small cottage and opened a carpentry shop, crafting custom furniture. Every morning, he walked Buddy along the lake, the water glinting under the Pacific Northwest sky. The threats, slashed tires, cryptic notes were gone, replaced by the hum of saws and the smell of cedar. One evening, Jake sat on his porch, a beer in hand, the stars bright above. His phone was off, a habit he'd kept since the trial. Aiden had called last week, saying, "You took her down, Jake. Be proud." Mia had texted, too, "You're a badass." But Jake didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd finally found himself. Laura thought she'd erased him, but she'd only pushed him to rebuild. He wasn't her shadow anymore. He was Jake Evans, carpenter, survivor, free. The lake rippled in the distance, and for the first time in years, he breathed easy, ready for whatever came next.